One of the first acquisitions was an ugly, untrained English bulldog whom they named Toby Belch. Within days of the dog's arrival, the rugs were soiled and the house reeked of urine and feces. What's more, the feisty dog started attacking the antiques and reproductions that the owner, a Bostonian named Ed O'Dowell, had left behind. Recalled Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy, "I told Ethel, for God's sake, get rid of that dog, because he's chewing on absolutely everything. And she said, oh, he's just going to be fun." A friend of Ed's and I told Ethel, he's wrecking Ed's furniture. And he did wreck it. Ethel's philosophy was, I'm not going to worry about it. Then, of course, when they moved out, there was a big to-do about the damage. There was talk about a lawsuit, but I think they settled it. In many ways, Cameron Lane was a mini Lake Avenue. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. Today we're going to keep going on in the Other Mrs. Kennedy, and we are in part 6. It is entitled Bobby's Wife, and we're going to talk about their engagement and their marriage, what the very beginning, early part of their relationship looked like. What did she think she was supposed to be as his wife? And then we're also going to talk about prior to the wedding, she started to have cold feet. She wasn't really sure if she could be a Kennedy wife. And we're going to talk about how that sort of resolved itself, what her parents thought of the marriage, what his parents thought of the marriage. It's an interesting chapter. I hope you enjoy it. But we're going to jump right in because I'm a little short on time today, and I want to get as much read as I can before I got to go make breakfast and do all the things. Okay. This chapter is called Engagement and Marriage. It begins, in the months immediately following graduation, Ethel did little except ponder her future with Bobby. She passed up on a European summer holiday with friends and remained at home, spending her time writing and helping her sister Pat prepare for her own wedding. After Georgianne, Pat would be the second of the Skakel girls to marry. Her fiancé, Llewellyn Peter Cuff, was a bookish assistant architect from Ireland, whose mother was a member of the radical Irish Republican Army. While he was getting his master's degree at Harvard School of Design, Llewellyn had been introduced to Pat by the mother of her Manhattanville roommate. The two had a whirlwind romance, and despite Pat's last-minute jitters, the Skakels announced her engagement on July 3rd, 1949, but with some reluctance. Big Ann had numerous misgivings, the main one being that, while Llewellyn was well-bred and highly educated, he didn't come from money, always a priority with her. Moreover, she was upset because Llewellyn intended to take Pat back to Dublin to live. Pat, on the other hand, was ecstatic about her upcoming nuptials. She'd made several visits to Ireland and had fallen in love with the country and its people, going so far as to speak with an Irish brogue. That's always annoying when people go to another country and decide that, they're going to sort of pick up the accent, like that's what one does. Moreover, Pat saw her marriage to Cuff as a way to escape the dysfunctional Skakels and Greenwich. As Mart McNeely later observed, Pat was more or less going into exile of her own choosing. Despite Big Ann's disapproval, she gave Pat and Llewellyn a spectacular wedding, with more than 700 attending the service and reception on October 8, 1949. There was a special papal blessing, and a close friend of the Kennedys, the Reverend Terence L. Connolly of Boston, officiated. The Mass was sung by Michael O'Higgins, a member of the Royal Irish Academy of Music, who was flown in from Dublin. Ethel, along with Georgianne and young sister Anne, was one of the bridesmaids. After a honeymoon at the cloisters in Georgia, the Cuffs sailed to Ireland aboard the Mauretania, soon taking up residence in a modest home in County Dublin. Back in Greenwich, Ethel, with no career in mind, had put her life on hold. With Bobby beginning his second year at law school, she was a bundle of pent-up energy. A number of her friends had already gotten jobs, many going to work for Father James Keller, a charismatic founder of the Christophers, a burgeoning anti-communist Catholic religious movement. With the Cold War growing hotter, others were moving to Washington to work for the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. With nothing but time on her hands, Ethel began having second thoughts about marrying Bobby. She feared she couldn't live up to the Kennedy name. Would she be fully accepted by them? Would Joe and Rose treat her like a daughter or as an interloper? Would the daffy Skakels embarrass the Kennedys? Did she have what it took to become a Kennedy? It was during this period of indecision that Ethel actually thought about dropping Bobby altogether and becoming a nun. When word of her predicament reached Bobby's ears, he was concerned, asking his sister Jean on the beach at Hyannisport one afternoon, "How can I fight God?" This was one of the few times in Ethel's entire life that she was truly introspective, said a close friend many years later. This really was the biggest decision she ever made. Later in life, she'd leave all decision-making up to Bobby and the Kennedy clan. Ethel confided her concerns to several close friends. One, Maplehurst headmistress, Mother Borg, suggested that Ethel come to work at the school, which had now moved to Greenwich. Ethel gratefully accepted. And for the next few months, she helped one of the younger nuns, Mother Marian Duffy, coach field hockey and assist with routine classroom chores. Ethel told me she was in love with Bobby, but also made me very much aware that she was thinking about becoming a nun. Duffy clearly recalled. She was very mixed up. So she went to her God to get an answer. She prayed in the chapel every day for an hour. By Thanksgiving, Ethel's confidence had been sufficiently restored. She flew to Charlottesville and told Bobby she'd marry him, and they immediately agreed on a June wedding. But when Bobby called his mother to tell her the good news, Rose Kennedy wasn't overjoyed. She wanted him to wait until after he had graduated from law school. "I had misgivings," she acknowledged later. Ethel later wrote off this important period of her life as uneventful. Once asked about the months leading up to her marriage, she replied, "I just sort of played around. It's hardly worth mentioning." Ever the social climber, Big Anne was initially thrilled about her daughter's choice for a husband. Unlike Pat's marriage to Cuff and Georgie Ann's to Dowdle, Ethel was entering the big time, and through this, as a Kennedy in-law, Big Anne saw herself vaulting to the pinnacle of American Catholic society. George Skakel, on the other hand, wasn't as excited. He thought of his daughter's future father-in-law as, quote, low-life Irish trash. It would not be long before Big Anne herself would lose her wonderment and come to despise the Kennedys too. But for now, she was exultant. As a side note, this projected, foreshadowed contention between the Skakels and the Kennedys that has continually been brought up but not explained is something I just cannot wait to get into. I can't wait till the drama happens between these two families because you know it's going to happen. Can you imagine the Kennedys cozying up to a group like the Skakels? I just don't even see it. Big Anne called smart set columnist Charlie Dearborn at the Chicago Herald-American and leaked news of the engagement, giving emphasis to the Skakels and their Chicago roots over the Kennedys. Under a headline that read, "Ethel Skakel's engagement to Robert Kennedy stirs society," Dearborn noted that the engagement is of the greatest interest here because Ethel is a Chicagoan by birth. Ethel and young Kennedy have been keeping company for some time, therefore the betrothal was not unexpected. You can be sure the wedding in June will be on an impressive scale. The Skakels are famous for their large, lavish parties. Meanwhile, the formal engagement notice that appeared in newspapers across the country was a concoction of fiction and overstatement, showing the fine hand of Joe Kennedy, a master manipulator of the press, a born publicist. It said that Ethel, quote, is now completing postgraduate work at Columbia University, and that Bobby, quote, served with the Navy for 3 years during the war. He traveled extensively as a writer of newspaper articles. In reality, Bobby's military experience was minimal. Don't we know it was like 2 months on a ship? His journalism merely a perk arranged by Joe himself. And as far as anyone can remember, Ethel never did advanced work at Columbia. She might have taken a few courses, said Courtney Murphy-Bonoist. To celebrate the forthcoming nuptials, the Skakels threw a lavish engagement party in early January 1950 at Lake Avenue, inviting some 200 friends and relatives. The meal was elegant, but most of the guests never got a chance at the enormous bowl of beluga caviar that Big Anne had set out on a card table. Her sons and their pals had swooped down and taken the delicacy out of the garden, devouring it in minutes. Heathenish behavior. Meanwhile, Ethel went from guest to guest, showing off an elegant jeweled compact. "Look what Mrs. Kennedy gave me," she trilled. This is just, like, do they have no raising? Has nobody ever shown them any social graces whatsoever? Scarfing down caviar and flashing the gifts that you were given? What is this? But the real centerpiece was the engagement ring, a tremendous marquee diamond. Unlike most young couples of the era, Ethel and Bobby did not window shop together in the traditional romantic search for the perfect ring. One day, shortly before the engagement party, a gentleman from Cartier arrived at the Skakel home. He delivered a huge tray of rings, recalled Courtney Murphy-Benoist, who saw the selection. Ethel chose an exquisite diamond. It wasn't the biggest, and it certainly wasn't the smallest, but it was beautiful. It was all done very privately, very low-key. None of it was pretentious, but you just don't see very many trays of rings from Cartier's. The Skakels thought it was very generous of Bobby, since the Kennedys were notoriously tight. Bobby, who wasn't present when Ethel made her choice, put the ring on her finger a few days later. Still, Ethel felt like a member of royalty. "I'm like a princess in a fairy tale," she squealed. Ethel and her old chums, Pixie and Pan, were all getting married within weeks of one another, and Ethel couldn't wait to show off her ring to them. One day, they got together to compare stones. Pixie and I were looking at our little rings, and Ethel arrived with this huge diamond that you could have landed a plane on, recalled Pan. She said, "Oh, kids, I just have to have this one because my hands are so big." Which, of course, they weren't. Which is interesting that Pan should say that, because Pan said earlier in the book that the reason that Ethel had taken up piano was because her hands were so big. So which is it, Pan? I don't like pan. Anyway, shortly after the engagement party, Ethel and Bobby went on to a week-long ski trip in Sun Valley, Idaho. It was an exciting time for the Skakels. In April, Georgianne had her first child, following 5 years of trying to conceive. The Daddles named her Georgianne and called her Little Georgianne. By early May, complex plans for Ethel's wedding were in place. Big Ann had organized the massive affair, including a huge party at her home with military precision. A small army of servants and cooks had been hired. 1,200 invitations had been sent out, placing a burden on the tiny Greenwich post office. An enormous tent of circus-like proportions would be erected on the grounds to handle the wedding feast. Entertainers were booked. One of the favorites was Joe Kennedy's close friend, Morton Downey, the Irish-American tenor whose son, Morton Downey Jr., would one day become a conversational television and radio talk show host. On the surface, relations between the Skakels and the Kennedys appeared amicable in those hectic and anxious weeks before the wedding. But tensions were already growing between the matriarchs of the two families. One issue in dispute was over where the Kennedys would stay. Big Ann had invited a number of old friends and relatives to lodge at Lake Avenue, but not the Kennedys. Her thinking was, they have houses and apartments everywhere, let them find their own place. Betty Skakel Medale recalled the controversy clearly years later. The Kennedy clan decided that it would be convenient to stay at Lake Avenue, but Ann decided it wasn't convenient. Not for her, not for the other Skakels, not for their friends. No one pushed Big Ann around, not even Rose Kennedy. Aunt Ann liked to have the privilege of inviting and not have it wished upon her. The Kennedys didn't like it at all. Except for Jean, who would be a special house guest of Ethel's, the Kennedys were forced to make other arrangements. Man, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm kind of with Big Ann. You know, you should have the privilege of inviting people to stay at your house, not them descending upon you, especially when everyone has so much money. You know, it isn't as though you need to stay here, like it's either here or the Motel 6. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that you guys can figure out your own way, Kennedys. But then again, I guess the Kennedys felt like you have this massive house, why are you being so stingy with it? But they already had a house full of guests. I don't know. It just seems like, why are we fighting over something so unimportant? Find somewhere to stay. There's plenty of places. Is this really the way we want to start things out? Apparently it was. The week leading up to the wedding was filled with excitement. Rose threw a weekend house party at Hyannisport for the bride and groom, the ushers, the bridesmaids, and other friends, most of whom stayed at a nearby inn. The young people sailed during the day and danced in the evening. Bobby and Ethel escaped from the throng for one night to dine alone at the Stork Club. The next morning their picture appeared in the New York Mirror with gossip columnist Barclay Beekman's explanation that they were making last-minute plans for the wedding. Back in Greenwich, Big Ann made final preparations for the spectacular reception at the house, filled with relatives from Chicago and friends from all over. Bobby arrived one evening with his rowdy Harvard football pals. "Just look at them," marveled Ethel's father to one of the guests. "This is the Harvard team, and they're playing musical chairs." He couldn't believe how innocent it all seemed. Musical chairs was a far cry from the free-for-all bachelor parties that were thrown for Bobby at the Harvard Club in New York. The wedding festivities began on a typically wild and wet note, not due to the weather, a few hours before Ethel left for the church. Long ago, Big Ann had determined that with her and the girls throwing so many parties, it would be convenient and cost-effective to have one room in the house equipped like a beauty salon. Using one of her many bogus business letterheads, Big Ann was able to purchase shampoo and cosmetics at wholesale prices, along with hair dryers and other tools of the trade. On the morning of the wedding, all the bridesmaids had their hair done at Lake Avenue by beauticians brought in from town. Afterward, they dashed outside to mix with the Skakel and Kennedy boys, and as usual, things got out of hand. "A lot of the bridesmaids got thrown in the pool," recalled a guest. "Needless to say, their hair was a wreck." I really wasn't like a bridezilla or anything. I just wanted to get married. At a certain point, I was like, to heck with all these details. Somebody else just choose it. I want to show up, But I can tell you right now that if I had been a bridesmaid at this wedding, or even the bride at this wedding, and everyone was throwing the girls in the pool and wrecking all the work that it takes to look good, I would have just been real agitated, I think is the best way to say it, real agitated. It would just, even if I was used to this wild and woolly way, could we just prolong the crazy just until I can get down the aisle with all these girls? And then, throw us in the pool if you want to. But can we just, not have, is it possible to just get through a day here at the Skakel house without becoming drenched by the end of it? Anyway, Rose Kennedy spent the night before the wedding at her home in Hyannisport, arriving in Greenwich early in the morning. Joe Kennedy, who had spent the night with a female friend, arrived later in the day from New York. The Skakel spread, the food, the decorations, was so elaborate and grandiose that Hearst Society columnist Igor Cassini, alias Cholly Knickerbocker, rushed over to greet Joe, telling him, "I know why that son of yours is marrying that girl, for her money." Meanwhile, a special train from Boston had carried Bobby and some of his guests to Greenwich for the big day. It was truly a wedding of royal proportions. Close to 2,000 guests, socialites, diplomats, leaders of industry, politicians, entertainers, blue-collar friends from the old days, mostly Irish, mostly Catholic, were present. Hundreds more than had been invited. Outside, a throng of the curious from town had gathered in hopes of seeing the famous faces. The perfume of white peonies and lilies filled the air at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church that Saturday, June 17, 1950, the day Ethel Skakel, 22, was formally inducted into the Kennedy clan with the blessing of the Pope. George Skakel escorted his daughter to the altar around noon. A virgin, Ethel wore white, and so did all the bridesmaids, which is unusual. Looking like a princess, Ethel walked down the aisle wearing a satin gown made with a fitted bodice, finished with an off-the-shoulder neckline, and a bertha of Point de Venise lace embroidered with pearls. Her tulle veil was fastened to a headdress with matching lace, trimmed with orange blossoms. She carried a bouquet of lilies of the valley. Pat Skakel Cuff, who had flown in from Ireland, served as Ethel's matron of honor, and little Anne was maid of honor. Both wore white lace over taffeta, their wide hats of white organza trimmed with pink gardenias and baby's breath. Ethel's 6 bridesmaids, similarly dressed, included Georgianne, her sister-in-law, Pat Caroon Skakel, drunk by the time the ceremony started, her cousin, Celeste Solari, Jean Kennedy, feeling victorious for having been the matchmaker, a somewhat dejected Eunice, who'd just been robbed of her jewels at the Ambassador Hotel in Chicago, and Pat Kennedy, whose romance with Jim Skakel was on the wane. Massachusetts Congressman Jack Kennedy served as his brother's best man. The ushers included Ethel's 3 brothers, Bobby's younger brother Ted, George Terrian, and Bobby's football pals, a motley pack of bruisers, wide-shouldered and beefy. Where did Bobby get these characters? Big Ann wondered aloud. Big Ann. We gotta get a book on Big Ann. The Reverend Terence L. Connolly performed the ceremony and was the celebrant of the nuptial mass. Even he had to chuckle when he saw the George Skakel Jr. Lem Billings incident that could have touched off an old-fashioned Donnybrook. Sitting behind Billings, whom he didn't know, the already inebriated Skakel tossed a few coins in the aisle. He leaned over and quietly asked the effeminate Billings if he wouldn't mind picking them up. When he leaned over, George kicked him in the behind, sending Billings sprawling as the wedding procession was starting. As Jim Skakel said later, George would do anything to get the action going. What a clown show! Like, it's all just a coat of paint on an old jalopy over here. The union of the Skakels and the Kennedy is like the greatest clash of all time. I just can't wait till they finally realize they aren't anything alike. With her marriage to 24-year-old Bobby, Ethel Skakel became the first woman to snag a Kennedy man since Rose was betrothed to Joe. The Boston Globe called the wedding the prettiest of the year and noted that the marriage unites 2 large fortunes. Friends of both the Kennedys and the Skakels, in fact, had debated which family was worth more. There was substantial belief that the Skakels had a larger net worth than the Kennedys. When the ceremony was over, everyone rushed back to Lake Avenue for the party, where the guests ate off of gold plates. Food was heaped high and liquor and champagne flowed. At one point, Big Ann pulled Ethel aside. Knowing well the Skakels' proclivities for drinking, she warned her daughter, "You don't drink and take care of your husband, too." It was one of the few pieces of advice from her mother that Ethel took to heart. In a big room on the 2nd floor, the wedding presents were carefully displayed for the guests to admire. Ethel was meticulous about knowing who gave each gift. She made a list. Later, a social secretary, a pal of Ethel's from college, addressed and sent thank-you notes. Meantime, John Dowdle had been assigned to help Bobby and Ethel plan their honeymoon itinerary, a project he undertook with mischievous glee. On a number of occasions, Bobby had stiffed Dowdle for $10 here, $20 there. Rubbing his hands together devilishly, Dowdle viewed the planning of Ethel's honeymoon, for which Bobby Kennedy would foot the bill, as payback time. Everyone in the family, except possibly Ethel, knew what he was up to and approved wholeheartedly. Ethel and Bobby had decided they wanted to spend their honeymoon in Hawaii, after which they leisurely would drive back across the country. They would be gone for 3 months. Dowdle proceeded to book them into the most expensive suites in the plushest hotels, the magnificent Royal Hawaiian in Waikiki Beach, the Swank Resort Hotel on Maui. Dowdle made certain every conceivable costly extra was put on Bobby's tab, such as the daily supply of fresh orchids that filled the bridal suite. After the honeymooners left for Hawaii, Georgianne had boasted to friends, "We took a great deal of pleasure in arranging the most expensive honeymoon because we knew it would annoy the hell out of Bobby." If the hotel bills bothered Bobby, Ethel never made mention of it. Her letters from Hawaii to friends at home told of the wonderful time they were having, how happy they were. The honeymooners stayed in Hawaii about a month. Back in Los Angeles, they picked up Pat Kennedy's convertible for a leisurely drive back east. Most honeymooners want to be alone, but when Ethel and Bobby reached Salt Lake City, they got together with Courtney Murphy Benoist, who is now living with her family there. The threesome toured the state for a few days, visiting Great Salt Lake and other sites. They made plans to get together the following summer. That's weird. It'd be one thing if Courtney had like a husband or a boyfriend or something who was visiting with them, like it was all four of them traveling together. But talk about being a third wheel. I don't want to hang out with you on your honeymoon. Anyway, Ethel and Bobby's destination was Charlottesville, Virginia, where Bobby would finish his final year of law school and where Ethel would begin to establish herself as a loyal wife, a terrible cook and housekeeper, a gracious hostess, and a fertile baby-making machine. In Charlottesville, her final conversion to Kennedyism would be completed. The road ahead appeared smooth and paved with gold. Oh, the delusions, the delusions. Okay, this chapter is called Charlottesville. By the time the newlyweds arrived in Charlottesville, the Korean War had started, and Ethel and Bobby were fearful that he might be called to arms. Bobby felt his brief stint in the Navy had been enough. He had no interest in wearing a uniform again. His goals now were to finish law school, start a family, and begin a career. But the Korean police action, as the politicians were calling the conflict, was having a shattering effect on the early months of Ethel and Bobby's first year together. At home, his father was railing about Americans' involvement in the war and, at Bobby's invitation, would make his views public in a speech at UVA condemning President Truman's doctrines. Every morning, Bobby and Ethel walked hand in hand to early Mass at Holy Comforter, the small neoclassical Roman Catholic church near the university, to pray for a quick end to the war. They'd then spend a few minutes in contemplation, admiring the huge oil painting of Christ with his arms extended. Their prayers were answered. Bobby was never called to serve. The Kennedys had set up housekeeping in a small 1.5-story whitewashed brick colonial home surrounded by shrubs and trees on Cameron Lane in a fashionable section of town near the law school. "Can you believe this?" Ethel asked visitors. "This place could fit in the living room of one of our guest houses. It'll have to do until Bobby graduates." To some of Bobby's less fortunate law school friends, already raising children and living in cramped off-campus apartments, the Kennedys' modest home seemed like a palace. Yeah, I've been waiting for this. I've been waiting for Ethel to get out from underneath the lavishness of her parents' grandiose lifestyle and find out the way the other half lives. I don't resent her having money. I mean, that's fine. I'm not like mad at rich people. I just hope that people don't think that I'm over here just always railing against the rich. I don't care if you're rich. Good for you. But what my question has just been is, how is Ethel going to deal with this when it's no longer just, I'm spending daddy's money, and now she's living with a husband who doesn't make as much as her dad does, who doesn't have the resources that her father had. It's no longer going downtown New York City to buy 5 pairs of shoes at some exorbitant rate. You know what I'm saying? And for her to complain about her little house, man, I just don't see this going well. One of the first acquisitions was an ugly, untrained English bulldog whom they named Toby Belch. Within days of the dog's arrival, the rugs were soiled and the house reeked of urine and feces. What's more, the feisty dog started attacking the antiques and reproductions that the owner, a Bostonian named Ed O'Dowell, had left behind. Recalled Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy, "I told Ethel, for God's sake, get rid of that dog, because he's chewing on absolutely everything. And she said, oh, he's just going to be fun." A friend of Ed's and I told Ethel, he's wrecking Ed's furniture. And he did wreck it. Ethel's philosophy was, I'm not going to worry about it. Then, of course, when they moved out, there was a big to-do about the damage. There was talk about a lawsuit, but I think they settled it. In many ways, Cameron Lane was a mini Lake Avenue. The Kennedys' irresponsibility came as no surprise to their friends. Ethel's rooms at home and at school were always a mess, and so were Bobby's. His last Charlottesville landlord, Schatz Somers, was overjoyed when he married Ethel and vacated the 5-room, second-floor apartment that he shared with George Terrian. Bobby had ruined the wooden floors with athletic cleats and left cigarette burns on the mantel, among other damage. Others had the same take on Bobby in those days. "From the start, I didn't like him very much because he didn't respect other people's property," said law school classmate Jerry Tremblay, who became a lifelong friend of the Kennedys. "I was a poor kid. I didn't have any money. My wife and I were just married, and we had a nice coffee table that someone had given us. Bobby would come to visit, and he'd put his big old dirty boots on it. I didn't like that, and neither did my wife. Although our apartment was rather austere, we didn't like to abuse any of the furnishings in it. I thought, what the hell is with this guy? Bobby had a lot of money, and he should have acted differently because of his upbringing. He had a beat-up Chrysler convertible that had belonged to his father. The top wouldn't go up, and the interior of the car was a mess. Bobby's dogs had ripped up the upholstery, and there was dog hair all over everything, but he didn't care. When we went to the movies, he'd say, 'Hey, Jerry, you got a couple of bucks?' I'd never get paid back. And that was the way all those Kennedys were. They never traveled with money. Classic. Classic. Is this not what we've seen time and time again? Why do these rich people walk around and think that it's the poor people who are supposed to foot their bills? Every single time. Over and over and over and over and over and over and over we've seen this. These rich people just waltz through life and are like, you got a couple of bucks? No, I don't. I don't actually. But you do. Why don't we go to a bank and you can get some of it? Like, enough already of this. Looking around all the day for a handout from the poor people who are barely scraping together dinner. Also, Bobby's personal appearance meant little to him. Bobby was really sloppy, recalled Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy. Not long after they married, Bobby and Ethel came to our family's farm. Bobby was wearing an old pair of gray slacks with the edges fraying where he had cut them off to make them into shorts. The pants had big holes in them and he wasn't wearing underwear. What? No. Please don't. What? I mean, you go into a farm, you want to wear your, grubby clothes, fine. Wear your rags. But put some underwear on! My father said, you better go home and change your clothes. He actually kicked him out. At least Bobby could have worn a jock strap, but he didn't give a damn about clothes or anything. Ethel thought he was cute no matter what. That is so embarrassing, I cannot even handle it. Oh, I'm cringing inside. Can you imagine somebody coming over to your house and your dad being like, you need to leave because the person's business was hanging out of the holes in their pants? I mean, the whole scene is crazy. After a few months of matrimony, Ethel saw to it that Bobby bought a wardrobe befitting his station in life, and when he balked about wearing his new clothes, she'd buy him more. Ethel definitely had an influence over the way he looked and dressed, said Jerry Trampley. Even Bobby's own mother noticed the changes Ethel had wrought. One of the reasons for her admiration of Ethel, Rose Kennedy noted years later, was because she had, quote, managed to get Bobby to pay attention to clothes, even to the extent that eventually he became known as being quite well dressed. I've always felt that appropriate dress and grooming are part of good manners, and that good manners are important. Thanks, Rose. Friends observed that Ethel was Bobby's opposite, extremely confident, outgoing, active, energetic, a stylish dresser, a party giver, and a social butterfly, but just not very sophisticated. In many ways, she was her mother's daughter. Like Big Ann with George, Ethel was so intensely serious about her relationship with Bobby, she was desperately in love with him, said Charlottesville friend Sue Drake. All right, this is our last chapter. It's entitled Settling In, and Charlottesville was a quiet, segregated southern city. In the fall of 1951, it had a population of about 25,000, about 20% poor blacks who lived in shacks near the railroad tracks. Ethel's only contact was hiring them as domestics. Ethel didn't care a whit about civil rights in those days, said George Terrian. I don't think it bothered her one way or the other about having colored girls as servants. It never did. Besides, Ethel needed as much household help as she could muster, since she had neither the inclination nor the need to cook, clean, shop, or do other chores, despite having lots of free time during the day while Bobby was in class. The only dish she could put together and get out of the oven without burning was an appetizer called Cheese Dreams, which tasted like glue and raw dough. Finally, Bobby had had it with Ethel's efforts in the kitchen and persuaded his bride to give up cooking altogether, after she prepared a meal that consisted of 4 vegetables but no meat. Ethel's concept of house cleaning was to, as Terrian put it, haul a bunch of people in, have them take everything out, have it all cleaned, and then have them bring it all back. She was one of those women who could not cope with the kitchen, said Sue Drake, whose husband, Phil Drake, was a classmate of Bobby's. The Drakes had gotten married a year before the Kennedys, and Sue was working part-time to help make ends meet. Like the Tremblays, they were a bit envious of Bobby and Ethel's immense financial resources. Ethel entertained constantly, but she wasn't very good at it because she was still trying to figure out how to cook, Sue Drake recalled. Ethel depended on friends like Sue to keep the fledgling Kennedy household functioning smoothly. Having a circle of handmaidens and acolytes to serve her would continue through Ethel's life. Having fun was always a prerequisite for Ethel. As soon as she arrived in Charlottesville, she set out to find an appropriate place to ride and play tennis. As Ellie Tremblay recalled, Ethel had a lot of time on her hands to fill. Ethel decided that she and Bobby should join Charlottesville exclusive Farmington Country Club, whose main building, erected in 1803, was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Farmington's golf course was considered one of the best in the region. The tennis courts were superb, and the view of the rolling Virginia countryside was spectacular. Black waiters in starched uniforms served mint juleps to gracious women in straw hats and bourbon to gentlemen in blue blazers. Blacks and Jews were not permitted to join the club or to be invited as guests. The Skakels had belonged to restricted clubs for years, and so had the Kennedys. Joe Kennedy's anti-Semitism was well known. He'd often be heard referring to Jews in derogatory terms, and Bobby emulated his father's stance on such issues in those days. Through the university, Ethel arranged for a student membership that gave her and Bobby all of Farmington's benefits at a reduced rate. Both would remain active, happy members of the club until they left Charlottesville. Knowing Ethel loved to ride, Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy introduced her to Ellie Wood Keith, who had a big horse farm outside Charlottesville. The two got along famously, and Ethel was given access to the stables and the horse of her choice. Murphy's father also introduced Ethel and Bobby to Charlottesville Hunt Club set. Many of Ethel's college friends, following the Sacred Heart tradition, continued their Catholic Action activities now that they were out of school and beginning families or careers. Anne Marie, for one, had taken a first aid course and was volunteering her time by driving poor pregnant women from rural areas to Charlottesville for prenatal care. She also was performing postnatal care and donating her time at the local hospital. "This was just a natural follow-up to the Catholic Action I had done at school," said Murphy. "But in Charlottesville, Ethel never did anything like that. She'd say to me, 'Let's go play tennis.' And I'd tell her I can't. And she'd say, 'Oh, do it later because I want to play now.' And I tell her these women had appointments, they didn't have phones, that I had to get out there and get them to the doctor and then take them back home. And Ethel would say, 'Oh, forget it. Come on. Let's play tennis.'" Ethel's just living in a world of her own. How boring. There's so many things she could have been doing with her time that would have been interesting and given her life some meaning and purpose. Not least of which is like learn how to clean your house and cook a meal. Right? I mean, charity begins at home, and your husband's over here eating glue and raw dough. So let's start there. And then once you've mastered that, let's help the society around you. You've got nothing to do. You've got no kids. You've got no job. You've got nothing to do. Can you really play tennis all the days of your life? How boring. And half your friends can't play with you anyway because they're busy doing something with their lives, like helping others. Why don't you go hang out with your friends by helping others, and then you guys can go play tennis? Can you really play tennis for hours and hours and hours? Well, I mean, don't you want something more out of life? That's something I don't understand is I think I would just get bored of just going and doing fun things all the time, but then coming to a home that's like a mess, everything's torn up and there's no food to eat. I mean, I don't care if I got to play tennis. I can't stand to come home to my hellacious house. But that doesn't seem to have bothered her. Boredom, like lack of culture, and a messy house with nothing to eat doesn't seem to bother her. I got to get the simple things in life settled. I guess I'm just a simple person, but I like to come home and the house is clean and there's something to eat, right? I mean, call me crazy, but that would make me happy. Playing hours and hours of tennis, but then coming home to a hellhole? No, thank you. Most weekends, Ethel and Bobby used one of the Great Lakes carbon planes to fly north to either Greenwich or Hyannisport, or south to the Kennedy Palm Beach digs. If they stayed in town, Ethel threw small dinner parties, usually inviting the Drakes and Trembleys, Anne Marie, and George Terrian. Everybody liked her. But Ethel never had very many intimates in Charlottesville, said Sue Drake. She was devoting all of her time to Bobby. He was the most important person in her life. It was during those get-togethers that Ethel, while playing parlor games, displayed the scrappy and pugnacious side of her personality that often galled her Charlottesville pals. The games, charades, 20 questions, sardines, indirect questions, and ambassadors, were a Kennedy tradition that Ethel had quickly adopted. In order to keep up with Bobby, she had begun reading almanacs, encyclopedias, newspapers, and general interest magazines. She took it quite seriously. She told me she was reading and trying to learn more. And I remember her saying, "I just got to keep up with the Kennedys. I have to be on top of everything," recalled Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy. And Ethel's study paid off because she usually won. If she didn't, she'd force her opponents to continue playing long into the night until she did win. Ethel just doesn't seem like she's a lot of fun. Like, I know everyone's like, "Oh, she's such a screwball. She's just, she's fun." But she doesn't seem fun to me. She seems like a simpleton who always had to win. Ethel and Rose, equally competitive and assertive women, once got into a debate over whether Paul Revere's Midnight Ride was on April 19th or April 18th, which Ethel claimed it was. "Ethel, dear," Rose responded, "one of my brothers was born on the 19th of April, and it's been a big celebration half my life, so you're wrong." Ethel wasn't about to concede, even to the woman whom she revered. "Do you mind if I get the book?" she asked as she barreled her way to a shelf. Ethel, it turned out, had the correct answer. Revere's ride began on the evening of the 18th. I can't say I wouldn't have also been proud of that if I'd been Ethel. Rose over here being like, "My brother was born on the 19th, and so that's how I know." That's got nothing to do with it. Friends felt that Ethel and Bobby made a perfect couple because they were equally competitive. Jerry Tremblay got a taste during a visit to Hyannisport. Near the Kennedy house was a deep gravel pit. "I'll bet I can jump farther down that than you can," Bobby boasted. I said, "No, you can't." So I ran like hell and jumped over the precipice and landed at the bottom. Then Bobby jumped and missed the bottom by 3 or 4 feet. He didn't land quite as far as I did, so he said, "Okay, let's do it again." I said, "Hey, Bob, I only have to beat you once," but he wouldn't give up. "Let's do it again, let's do it again." He was like a child. Suddenly he changed the rules and it was 2 out of 3. Classic with these competitive types. Ethel was ruthless on the tennis court at Farmington, where the Kennedys played doubles, usually with the Drakes. She wanted to win, demanded to win. It was a lot easier to let her win than to try to beat her, which we could have done. So we purposefully lost, acknowledged Sue Drake. Ethel had a lot of self-confidence. I never saw her as a naturally fine athlete, but she was determined to excel, and she did. One afternoon, Ethel's brother George, who wasn't very good at tennis and had a bum leg to boot, was playing doubles with Bobby and Ethel. The only thing George Skakel had going for him on the court that day was his beautiful Scandinavian female partner, one of his many mistresses. She'd lure Bobby to the net and Ethel in from the back court, while Skakel lobbed ball after ball over Ethel's head, scoring point after point. The Kennedys were angry, especially when they spotted George and his girlfriend laughing at them. Bobby flung his racket on the court, picked up his balls, and stormed off, with a seething Ethel in tow. "It's our court, so you better watch your manners," Skakel yelled mockingly. "Yeah, well, they're my tennis balls and we're leaving," Bobby screamed back petulantly. In recounting the episode to a friend, George Skakel doubled over with laughter. "Bobby's such a chicken shit little bastard. He thinks he's such a tough guy. I can't figure out what Ethel sees in that little prick." As George Terrian noted, none of the Skakel brothers liked Bobby, but I don't think it bothered Ethel one bit. Years later, in the early 1990s, long after Ethel had established herself as a Washington monument, she still had the same ferocious drive to win on the courts. Visitors to her private tennis courts at Hickory Hill received pre-match briefings from an employee. The bottom line was, lose to Mrs. Kennedy, or risk getting disinvited. What a silly, silly, silly woman. Ethel always had that arrogant side to personality, bordering on being outright nasty, observed a lifelong friend. From her Charlottesville days onward, it became more intense because she was always trying to prove that she could be a Kennedy, could be competitive like a Kennedy, combative like a Kennedy, cold and calculating like a Kennedy. She felt that she had to prove that to Bobby, prove it to her in-laws, Joe and Rose, and to herself on a daily basis, all of her life. And she succeeded. So that's where we have to stop. I had wanted to read a little bit more, but time's slipping away, so I've got to go. But I hope that you guys are enjoying this reading. I'm loving this because, the back of the book really promised us the fact that Ethel was a very difficult person to get along with. And so far, I feel like she's been a little bit annoying, but we haven't necessarily seen this kind of edge to her yet. And I think we're starting to see that. If you're going to throw a fit because you didn't win at tennis, or you're going to, in your later years, basically, the staff has to tell you, if you don't let her win, you're not invited back. Like, what is wrong with this person? And I think that all of, the cutesy little, funny little pranks that she was pulling in college, so, the cutesy stuff, that's going to give way to some ugliness now that she feels like she has to scrap and fight for her place in this Kennedy lineup. So I think it's about to start getting ugly. If it hasn't already been ugly in its own way. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys later this week. Bye.